kind of rolling into things here. Interested, Kyle, in just kind of your background, the sort of elevator pitch, Cliff Notes version of like where you're coming from insofar as your profession, and then also specifically like what it is that made you kind of want to do this and talk to us and have this conversation to begin with. And that way we can kind of just roll into things. So floor is yours, whatever you feel like is relevant for people to know in terms of where you're coming from.
Absolutely. So I've been working as a personal trainer now for just under a decade. I've been seeing clients one-on-one for now, exclusively just only one-on-one clients now for almost 7 years. Basically over the last, roughly decade, I think my focus in like the health and fitness realm has been a little scattered. I've always been really interested in endurance training, and every year I've basically had some sort of endurance goal that I've been tackling. So I've had an on season and an off season, and in that off season I've typically really dialed down on strength. But I'm getting into a point in my life now where I'm 32 years old, and by the time that I'm 40, I really want to look back at what I've built and build something that really stands the test of time. And that's really going to come down to like muscle mass, body composition, bone density, and and I'm looking at potentially being in this profession forever. I really love what I do, and so I want my body to be able to keep up with the demands of the profession as well. Yeah, I mean, I told you guys a little bit about just my recent experience of just exploring physique with a little bit more focus, and how I cut down from roughly where my weight is now, around 185 pounds, down to 165 at a pretty low body fat percentage. Slowly climbing back, changing the way I train a little bit, not only training less, but just with a little bit more focus on hypertrophy. And where in the past, it's been like, all right, I'm like running, cycling, mixed martial arts, and there's just a lot going on, and trying to be disciplined on that front. And I'm looking at the next 8 years essentially is like, how much muscle can I put on, right? I want to. I'm really looking at my 30s as this time to really narrow my focus, create a really strong, calculated plan to get there. And I think this is what most of the conversation today can be about, is just not only how to improve how I train, but setting some very specific goals to help me along that journey. Like 8 years is like a long time, but I think that having that long-term vision is something that I haven't really committed to in the past, and I'm really looking to put myself in that direction now.
Cool.
Good intro? Is that all right?
Yeah. I'm learning about you from your intro and also from your background. Are we in your room right now?
So this is the second room in my apartment. I've got basically like a home gym set up here that's like been with me, like all this like stuff collectively has been with me in and out of like COVID. I've got like a bunch of weights and all kinds of toys and bike. Yeah, like I'm a bit of a gearhead. I've got quite a few things in here.
Are those adjustable dumbbells behind you from Rogue?
Yeah, the manufacturer is I don't know how it's pronounced, NUO, like Nuo belt.
Yeah. I just those for like an apartment gym I was designing. If they want to sponsor the podcast, like we'll consider it.
Okay.
They're super cool looking. I mean, the ones that I got for
should we do like a home gym tour?
maybe next time. But they have these like they're matte, they're rounded, they're not like squared off like some of the other adjustable dumbbells.
Yeah.
This like, arrivals, departures thing behind you with some sort of like motivational
Oh yeah.
slogans on it. So I know you're someone who probably likes to travel. You're someone, with definitely like, a long-term vision and kind of like an idea of, who you want to be and where you want to go, and you work out. That's what I see like in the room behind you here. And this,
Yeah, that's a pretty solid take.
this is the first time on this podcast that I've switched to like the individual speaker view, because I really wanted to like zoom in and read what was going on behind you there. So fascinating. I feel like I really have learned a lot about you, both verbally and visually, in the last few minutes here.
Yeah, people's office can tell. You can, it says a lot about a person, I think.
Yeah, I mean, what is like? Let's see. Two cats
Nice.
look at each other. I got pills, squat shoes, a BFR cuff,
Pills, cats, and gear.
and like a ton of Amazon boxes.
Ethan gets like five. Ethan gets 5 Amazon packages a day at this point in his career.
Meals, another potential sponsor of this podcast.
Yeah, there you go.
All right.
We're already up to 2 sponsors already, in these first 10 minutes. So
I feel like in the future, it's not that we need them to pay us. We just want to say that we have sponsors.
yeah.
Like I really just want the t-shirt.
Yeah, like, if you want to support this podcast, like check the description, like that kind of thing. Like we're not going to spend, 45 seconds. You ever get to a podcast on Spotify and it's like you're really in the groove, like you're really into what they're saying, and then boom, minute and a half long ad, and then you just take your finger and you poke the scrolly thing and you scroll it all the way to the side and it sends you another, and you take your finger and you scroll it all the way to the side. There's usually only 2, but we won't be having that here.
Like the really fast voice where you get
yeah,
dude, the worst. So I've been sleeping to like the sound of rain and thunder, and
you mean like on white noise?
Yeah,
like on a white noise app. Okay,
I just YouTube like
all right. You didn't mean like natural rain and thunder.
It's like it's either I don't know if they like go out into the woods and record this, or
no, I'm just saying it's not coming from outside your window, right? It's coming from your device.
That would be preferable, but yeah, it's coming from my
device. All right.
And they're like, it's literally built for sleep, and they'll run an ad in the middle of it. It's like 2 a.m, and the fucking guy comes on that's like mesomorph, ectomorph, like eat for your body type, and fucking like wake up in a cold sweat.
That's awesome.
That guy, that guy's on every one of my YouTube videos.
Yeah, you got to get AdBlock Plus. Anyway, so one of the things that I was thinking about, and probably why Ethan will be doing a majority of the talking and the answering here, for amongst other reasons, is I really, really am uncomfortable with setting long-term goals and focusing on long-term goals. I'm uncomfortable with like outlining things before I start them. I in school was always someone who never turned in the outline on time because I thought it was like irrelevant to the process, and other people were over here being like the outline is the most important thing to my process. So I realized that everyone is different, but I am someone who like I start to get uncomfortable thinking about planning things with very specific topics. If I'm going to like plan a trip, I want to know like where we're staying, where we're going on each day. Like that kind of thing is a little bit different to me. But when it comes to goal setting and like, this comes up a lot in just like questions that I get about learning and like trajectory of learning. Like what should my long-term to medium-term plan be in terms of like which topics I'm starting to learn and when, and how should I go about those? And I just think about like, okay, what problems are you currently solving for, and what kinds of things are you currently most interested in? And then I just go sort of all in on those and just kind of, I see where those kinds of things take me. So I'm sure that there are certain things that maybe you're more inclined to think about that line of thinking in relationship to, but in terms of like, you know, the 8-year planning, like I'm barely thinking, you know, a couple days ahead, and as it relates to my specific goals, and just even goal setting to begin with, I'm not particularly keen on, just insofar as my own process goes. So I'm interested to kind of hear what Ethan's take on that is, because Ethan is someone who has had you know, Ethan had a very long-term goal for a very long time. So if you want
Yeah.
to kind of.
Yeah. I mean, I think what you said, Ben, about just that like visceral discomfort with the long-term planning,
Yeah.
I think that is one thing to just kind of like pause and note when you're about to go about, when you're about to go about, when you're doing, you know, a process like this. You know, before this podcast, I'll usually take a walk. I'll think about, you know, who we're interviewing, if we have any pre-prepared questions. And that's kind of like my reflection time, walk in the woods kind of deal, always has been. And when, you know, I'm going on a walk like that and I'm thinking about, you know, a question like Kyle has about, you know, what's the 8-year plan? How do I break this down, you know, into smaller chunks? Like, how do I, you know, create this, you know, whole trajectory? I think one thing that's valuable to do, at least to like notice when you're in that process, is like, how do you actually feel when you're doing that? You know, Ben mentioned that it just like creates a little bit of anxiety in him, and I would say that like I feel the same sort of thing. Usually, when I'm inclined to do a lot of planning and organizing, it's actually because I'm just like in that acute state of feeling a bit anxious or feeling like, you know, I need to control the process. And that's kind of a strategy that I've used to feel like more in control and feel like I can get started, rather than something that actually meaningfully changes the trajectory of what I do. So I think it's important to note when, you know, that's a side effect and when that's actually like the necessary thing in front of us. So I think for, you know, anyone who's really inclined to do a lot of planning, a lot of goal setting, like it might be relevant to just like whatever your process is, it's in the shower, it's going for a walk, you know, whatever that is, just like pause for a second and notice like what you actually feel in your body when you're doing that. And if what you feel is, you know, a degree of tightness somewhere, like a degree of angst, um, you might want to just, you know, second guess, like if you're doing it to solve that discomfort, if you're doing it as a means to sort of like center yourself, or if this is actually like requisite to where you're trying to go. And I think in terms of like figuring out, you know, is it requisite to where you're trying to go? Like anything else, it's kind of cliche to say, but you know, we start with the why. Like,
Mm.
why is it that we have this goal in the first place? What is it going to accomplish for us? And like, is what we're doing actually the thing that's going to accomplish the goal that we think it's going to accomplish? You know, so I want to make, you know, $1 million, therefore I'm going to be a professional bodybuilder. It's like, yeah, that's probably like not the best route to accomplish that goal. So, you know,
Yeah.
with that primary thing in mind, just kind of like when you're going about the planning process, just kind of stop for a moment, notice what you're feeling, notice what kind of sensations it brings up. You know, if you have any comments on that, Kyle, and then secondarily, just like what sort of the impetus, like what excites you about the process? What is the sort of why behind you want to do this at 40?
Yeah, I mean, I think just when it comes to the subject of goal setting, whenever I put something down on paper that I want to accomplish, it's something that it feels a little out of reach. It feels like a little impossible. And it makes me uncomfortable. Not necessarily like in the moment when I'm setting the goal, but I know that the process will be difficult and uncomfortable, and that will be beneficial for me, and you know, in a measurable amount of ways, right? On the subject of, you know, how this whole thought process makes me feel, personally, like planning makes me excited. I don't get nervous when I plan. For me, I think it's more of like a visualization tool. And I really like think about like what my life looks like in 8 years, what I look like in 8 years, how I feel in 8 years, um, all the positive impact that this goal could potentially have on my intellectual growth, my business growth. And I don't necessarily have like very specific goals on how achieving a physique that looks like this will benefit other areas of my life. But I just know that uh, the fact that this is something that excites me and will demand a lot of energy and focus and discipline, I know like just good things will come. I'm not really focused on exactly what it's going to do for me in terms of like, financial opportunity or anything like that. But I think that when I look back at my past training experience, not just coaching people, but just like me working out, just like doing fucking hard things that I've never done before. It's just like good things just come. It's like you just like put that energy into the universe, and it's like, all right, like I'm getting like new clients out of nowhere, like I'm meeting new people, creating new opportunities. So I don't. It's not super focused. I was definitely interested in your process, Ethan. In your, obviously your competitive career, and how you looked at things. In terms of just your long term vision and your whole thought process. But yeah, like it doesn't make me nervous. I don't think it's a counterproductive mindset. It's like for me, it's like when I know that I'm going in this direction, like I wake up in the morning and I think about, what everything is gonna look like.
Yeah.
Uh, yeah.
Two parts of that. The one part that I heard was like, how did I conceptualize like this process, to get to where I am now in bodybuilding, and then, where I want to go. Um, Bodybuilding for me is very much just a reflection of like who I already am, like the characteristics I already possess, not so much like who I want to be. So it's not me sort of thinking forward and thinking like I want to become this person, but more so like I am this person, and that gives me the opportunity to, explore more of that. So like you said, Kyle, definitely resonate with that idea of like, challenging yourself, like doing hard things that allow you to sort of explore the depths of yourself, but then also, like the posters behind you, like just see things, see new things, see not just in yourself, but see new things in the world and other people. Like there are relationships that come out of it. So for me, it's just an expression of like, I am this person. Let's, utilize those talents like to the fullest of their expression. And in doing so, interesting things happen. And then, the question then becomes like, well, to do something challenging, how specific can we be in that? So with your goals, if we say, well, is it challenging to gain 10 pounds? Is it challenging to gain 20 pounds? Is it challenging, to win a bodybuilding show? Is it challenging, to get down to X% body fat, whatever it is? And I think at like this stage in the game, we don't really know the answers to any of those things. Like I would say, we know on average, like most people over a training career can put on, 20 pounds or so and stay, relatively within, the body fat percentage they are or lower. Like that's, average. Like we kind of know these like group averages, right? But we have no idea where you fall along those lines. So really until you start moving, we don't really know like what, where to set that marker. And I think setting it, at the mean is really no better than setting it on either side of that. I very much keep like an input focus where it's like, these are the things that like I said, that I kind of already do. These are the things that like, the things that are ultimately going to result in the outcome, and just like checking those off every day. And then the outcome is not really something that like you get to determine. I imagine a goal being like, I want to find the perfect, partner in the next 3 years. I'm going to find, the perfect person to marry. And it's like, well, what are all the things, that I can do? Like, I can have like, decent hygiene, and I can like, have a reasonable like income. And, I'm going to have to like go out to places to meet people. And hopefully those places are kind of like a reflection of my interests. And you do all of these things and you check all of those boxes. But at the end of the day, you really don't get to control if that person shows up or not. So it's the same thing here. Like, you do all the things, but like, there's no mTOR button that you get to like just walk up to the wall and press, right? Like, you can do the requisite behaviors, but you don't control the outcome. So I think especially, the earlier on you are and the less you know what your response is going to be, the less you can really plan for it. But even now, like, it's different, every training block I go through is different. So I really stopped, setting those type of goals. And I do look back on like, I've probably had an iPhone for, well over a decade now. So I still have the same notes that I had, 10 plus years ago. And I look back through all of those goals because, like, man, I did a lot of that stuff. Like, I had, the posters up in the room and the vision board and the 1 year, 5 year, 10 year, today, the like, waking up, doing like the Tony Robbins type stuff, and just like, what am I grateful for? Like, what am I going to accomplish today? Like, what can I do to help other people? And it was like, when I look back on a lot of that stuff, I think like, number one, you don't get to control the timeline. You can say like, I want to do this in 3 years, 5 years, 10 years. And whether it be like, starting a business or building a physique or meeting the right person, it's just like, you don't get to control the timeline. Like, the only thing you get to control is the direction, and the direction I think fundamentally starts with like, who are you? What do you like to do? And then from there, like Ben said, you just start solving problems. And I think that's like the exciting thing, is there's just going to be an unlimited number of questions to ask, an unlimited number of like obstacles to get through, and they increase in almost like a logarithmic fashion, where it's like the obstacles at 280 pounds are exponentially harder than the obstacles at 220 pounds most of the time. And you just build more and more resilience to them, and you have to sort of buttress that with other areas of your life. And I agree, it's an exciting road where you get to experience a lot of interesting things, but I don't think it's a very like predictable one, and I do think you kind of just have to start with where you are today.
Yeah, well said. I think the most the biggest thing that really stood out is and like I need this like on my wall, I think, going forward, or maybe on my bathroom mirror, is you don't get to control the timeline, you get to control the direction. Mm-hmm. And that's like really gonna stick with me.
Yeah, and so I think one of the other things too, and this is not even really specific to you, Kyle, or any of your specific goals, but I think just goals in general, and just kind of expanding on what I said initially, I think part of the reason that I'm uncomfortable with them is because, to me, I tend to get very tunnel visioned when I pursue things. And oftentimes, if I tell myself that I have a goal, I get very tunnel visioned in my vision in terms of my creativity, and the direction that I'm taking things becomes limited. And so limitation, I think, in setting boundary in some ways can be very helpful in terms of setting the initial direction. But if you get too narrowly focused and too tunnel visioned on what you initially said, whether it be something you said today or yesterday or a year ago, it can kind of lead you down a path that you're almost sort of following for reasons that you might not understand eventually, right? It's almost like eventually this goal that you had set forth during this other time period, during this other environment when you had different problems, now no longer necessarily might make sense, a year from now, 2 years from now. And if you're sort of set on again, not really continuing to question what the motivations are for that goal, then at least for me, like just specific to my experience, I tend to just continue to do things without thinking about them because, X amount of time ago, I set this, trajectory for myself. And I sort of just followed that path for, a reason that I wasn't particularly, self-reflective about. And so I think that there's a fine line between setting that boundary and then getting sort of lost down that rabbit hole without remembering why you were there in the first place. And I felt like that's happened to me a bunch of times. And I think that it'll probably continue to happen. But as long as you're just sort of always checking in with yourself on like, which is why I think, a lot of people will say bad things about like something like journaling or just like writing down your thoughts or just figuring out what you think. But I think that is a tool for me that has been very helpful, is just continually sort of revisiting my thoughts, not in any sort of like anxious, worried kind of a way, but just in like a, hey, like I'm just checking in, like just like you check in on a friend, like you send them a text, like, hey, how's it going? That kind of thing. Doing that kind of thing for me has been very helpful, just to kind of continually make sure that I'm updated with myself, because I think things change and goals change a lot of times without our realizing it, and we end up going down these rabbit holes with a certain self awareness that maybe is lacking. So that just a kind of additional commentary on what my experience has been with goal setting, and maybe a little bit about like why I tend to be uncomfortable with it, is because I have a very like addictive personality. And so, there's that old, like, I think it's called sunk cost or whatever. It's like when you've invested a certain amount of time into something, you feel like you have to sort of do it. You have to, bring it to its completion. But I think, not that this is necessarily, again, directly related to this conversation, but in general, I actually find that quitting, like stopping doing something and pulling out of something, pulling away from something, is actually a lot harder a lot of times than continuing to do it. Because it usually means change. It usually means a perturbation in a routine. It usually means, a change in environment. And so they're just the being that self-aware to know when you should stop doing something too is something that I've valued more over time. Especially when it comes to like learning, and just, I'm sure this has happened to both of you, where you're so deep into a topic, and you're really deep into it because it's very interesting, but then you have this moment of realization where the thing that you're reading or the article that you're consuming or the thing that you're listening to is so like far down, this one rabbit hole or this one path, and it's so nuanced and it's so not helpful in practice, that you kind of come to that, moment of realization in, in a specific piece of content that you're consuming, and you sort of are able to then pull yourself out of it and have some perspective on the things that matter. I think those rabbit holes are important, but to the quitting thing or to the pulling away thing, I think that over time, that is a skill that becomes more and more important, especially when it comes to the long-term stuff that, inherently, like, that you want to do for some reason, but just making sure that reason is continually updated is important to me. So I don't know if that brings anything else up in you two, just in terms of general
very,
thought.
very I think I've got maybe like an interesting segue. Some feedback from what Ben just gave us. Ethan, do you think in your your bodybuilding journey there were maybe pieces of your personality, or like maybe deep emotional or psychological connections to like training approaches that you used to utilize in the past that you had to leave behind, or maybe other health and fitness things that you used to be passionate about that you realized were no longer helping you grow closer to your goal?
Yeah, that's a good question, because a lot of stuff actually comes to mind. I mean, first of all, I talked about, doing the things that you're kind of naturally inclined towards. And it's interesting how that can be useful to a point, and then you might actually have to diverge from that, like specifically in regards to training. So I was very strong early on. Like that's just something I was naturally inclined towards. Unfortunately, like the propensity for strength also has to be balanced with like the ability to survive it. And that's not something that I had a lot of. So I didn't set out with the original intention, like when I started lifting weights of being a bodybuilder. It was for football, and that kind of classic story of like the more that I trained, the more I realized that I actually liked the training more than I liked the sport of football itself. So it kind of came to this like line in the sand, football versus exercise science slash bodybuilding, and the route that I took there. But given that I was naturally inclined towards strength, now I would say just gradually over the years, I've moved further and further away from anything that's going to allow me to really, utilize that talent. Because ultimately, like with the goal being hypertrophy and not being strength, I really have to minimize like the costs that I'm paying for that. Minimize the side effects, as I often say, and those side
Yeah.
effects, case being orthopedic. I don't think that's like a problem. Most people really have. When I listen to other podcasts and like Q&As and stuff, I hear people ask questions that are like, no, you definitely don't have that problem. I can tell by the way you asked the question. Like I was just listening to a podcast like during breakfast this morning, and the person was like, well, Tom Platz, trained with 20 rep sets. Like, why would he do 20 reps if he could have just done 6 to 8? And it's like the answer to that is so obvious to me. It's like he was doing sets of 20 with like 500 pounds. Like, what do you think he would have used for sets of 6? Like it's that's their option. That's their option. Like
yeah, the risk of injury there just like starts to add up a little to a very uncomfortable amount.
Like if in your mind the discomfort or the time associated with doing a 20 rep leg press, it feels more stressful to you than doing a set of 6 to 8, you're probably not very strong. Like the reality is, yeah, it burns and like it's metabolically fatiguing, psychologically fatiguing in a different way than 6 to 8. But like it's if it's not the discomfort that you're running away from, if it's actually just like you want the results, and one comes with potentially more downside than the other, you just choose the one with less downside. So you can sometimes hear it in the question, like if someone actually has that problem or not. So that was one problem that I encountered pretty early on, and just gradually over time it was like, okay, I'm no longer going to deadlift, and then I'm no longer going to back squat. And that's not like advice for you or advice for like anyone listening to that, and that I think sometimes is where like camps are formed, where it's like, oh, this guy's anti barbells or whatever. It's just like, no, you're just solving the problem in front of you. Like I love training heavy and I love training with barbells. Like it would be awesome if I could just go in and like squat 800 pounds. That would be really fun. Like I really enjoy like getting up psychologically for a heavy lift. I really enjoy just like throwing stuff around and not thinking about it, and just like going to like a dungeon that just smells like piss and like and then along the way you just solve the problems that are in front of you. And like some people just don't have the same problems to solve, so they end up in a different place. With the problems that I had to solve and the solutions that, were in front of me, like I just charted a very specific course. So, one of those was changing my rep schemes, changing my exercise selection, changing my execution, but only out of what I perceived as, a necessity in that time. I think another big, just gradual paradigm shift for me has been moving sort of ever closer to specificity. And that's a pretty normal trend over time, where it's like the arc of a lifting career, there are some pretty common themes. Like it's common, for example, to sort of go to build volume, do more and more sets from like the beginner to intermediate realm. And then when you get bigger and stronger and you're in an advanced realm, oftentimes you actually do less work or you train less frequent. So you see enhanced bodybuilders, like really big enhanced bodybuilders tend to train less frequently. And I think a lot of that's just survivability. So the specificity for me, it's been a little bit different in the sense that like I actually explored a lot of things outside of bodybuilding in terms of just trying to like tack on, extra percentage points to my progress when I was natural. So, from purely from like a progress standpoint, I think if I would have gone enhanced like at a younger age, like I probably stopped making significant progress by the time like I was in early college years, where it was like by the time I was probably 20 or so, that was probably 90% at least of the progress that I was going to make. And I started training at like 12, 13, maybe. So it's like, we're talking about like, what is it, like 8-ish years, of like hard, dedicated training. But because really the goal, like we mentioned earlier, was like exploration, and the goal wasn't, of course, I did have this like vision of, being a professional bodybuilder, but, like I said, you don't get to necessarily choose that outcome. I was very interested in exploring the educational pieces of it. So went to school for exercise science and just traveled the country, meeting people, going to seminars, just learning everything I could. And a lot of that took me outside of bodybuilding, to strength conditioning, physical therapy realms, like functional medicine, all sorts of stuff that like I think expanded my repertoire, and allowed me to think differently about things. So had I just stayed like in the bodybuilding realm, um, I don't think necessarily like a lot of what I do today can't be solved by understanding like bodybuilding specific answers. But I do think the way that I think about things, the way I conceptualize things, like the way I go about solving problems is very different because I explored those other areas. But now when I'm consulting with other people and I'm coaching, most of the time the problem, like the answer is pretty simple, and it's kind of like specific to what you're actually doing. Like Ben and I have talked on other podcasts about where like you create an injury in the gym, it's probably a gym problem. Like it's probably going to be fixed by whatever you did to, mess yourself up in the first place. It's probably not going to be fixed by like finding some secret outside modality that like no one else does in the gym, and like that's the thing that's going to make you, bulletproof to next time you do it. It's probably going to be a really simple answer, like, yeah, every time you bench press it hurts, so maybe like bench press this way or dumbbell press this way, or whatever. Like, so at this point in my career, like I'm not doing an inordinate amount of stuff outside of like the bodybuilding realms. I'm not doing like, a ton of manual therapy. I'm not doing, any type of like, explosive or plyometric training. Like, I don't think there's, big percentage gains to be made by doing a lot of like non-specific, training. I think it mostly comes out of doing what's specific to your goal, managing the loads that you can recover from, and just having appropriate, time courses and appropriate stresses applied across those time courses. But certainly like exploring other realms has helped me to understand more broadly just how we manage stress like as an organism, and how to conceptualize like, what I might be going through at a different point in that cascade, where it's like, oh, this is normal. Like, expect that you're going to suffer here. Expect that you're going to feel this thing. Like, this is all part of the process of adaptation. So, hope that helps a little bit. I know we went in different directions.
Absolutely.
Kyle, so one of the things you outlined was just the sort of 8-year vision here. And I'm interested in sort of the first couple things that come to your mind when you think of problems that you're currently encountering, that you're currently trying to solve. So what is the first thing that kind of comes to mind when I say that?
So one of the problems that I'm trying to solve currently, all three of us have talked about this in some to some degree, and that's like a Muay Thai injury that happened in February. That has, it has improved pretty steadily since February, but continues to get in the way of training sometimes. And like Ethan talked about, a big part of tackling this problem appropriately is not about trying to find the cure, like trying to look for some magical potion to sprinkle on it, outside of just the training that I'm doing and developing a process of, all right, let's journal every day. Let's figure out, okay, I did these lower body, I did these exercises below the knee, just to be specific for the listeners. This is like a foot/toe injury that I suffered in combat sport. So I think we landed on just the fact that I needed to wipe the slate clean, because there was just so much mess, and it's really difficult to determine what's working and what's not working when there's just so many variables. And this is a conversation that we've had pretty recently, so I don't have a ton of data to fall back on right now that I can discuss necessarily, but that's one problem. But I honestly think that with time, that's going to resolve itself. The other problems associated with that 8-year vision.
Well, Kyle, just before you move on, E, did you have something to interject there?
Yeah, my first thought is okay, we've started with this, goal that we're going to put at the top of the page, which is I want to be, more muscular. And then underneath that, somewhere we have, okay, here are the current problems that are impeding me from getting there. And what I would want to know in relation to that is, where is that currently impeding you from the goal of building muscle? Can we be specific about I can't do this, therefore I can't build muscle?
I don't think that this injury is a large obstacle in building muscle, honestly. Specific to lower leg musculature, maybe, just because my ability to really grind deep into sets for right now, a straight leg heel raise is more problematic than a bent leg heel raise. But I even, let's just say that for the next few months, all I train is a bent leg. I remove the straight leg because it's creating problems, and then everything just gets better. And eventually I'll have a better grasp on appropriate training volume, appropriate training frequency without creating any issues. So, we're talking about one very small muscle group relative to what's going to make me look different.
That's kind of what I hear is I can't do straight leg calf raises the way I'm currently doing them. And then the next question we ask, well, does that matter? For the
it's I don't think it's very relevant to the big goal. That's just one problem that we've all discussed together pretty recently. I think some problems that are sort of have been solved pretty early on, in my coaching experience with Ethan, was just too much training. And, I'm only, our relationship is relatively fresh. But going from, roughly 120 and change working sets of exercise per week, which was looking sometimes 5, sometimes 6 days of training, down to now only 4 for almost 2 months. We're looking at 80 total working sets per week. That I think has solved a lot of problems and is setting the stage for a lot of progress. When we need to change things, I guess we'll cross that bridge when we get to it. But it's been really exciting and eye-opening how more intense my training sessions have become, how much hungrier I am to train psychologically, given the fact that now like I'm training less, I'm resting more. I feel like, it's such like it's such a simple part of the equation. It's just like, how much training are you doing? Like what is appropriate for me as an individual. And I feel like, I could continue to do this for a while and like, how long, we'll see what happens, but I could continue down this same path for a while and hopefully see a lot of success. I mean, we'll see what happens, I guess.
Yeah, I think with what I saw with you, Kyle, is much like with the toe injury, where it's like if you have I'm just making up a number. This probably isn't the reality at all, but just like imagine a different person has like 10 different exercises that they're doing for something, and some days they wake up and it hurts, and some days they wake up and it doesn't, or same thing happens with digestion, where it's like we're eating differently every day. There's no real meal plan. And some days you wake up with horrible digestion, some days you don't. Like I think with a lot of things early on, it's just about creating as much of a blank slate and as much like visibility as we can. Like sometimes we'll use the terminology like signal to noise. Like that's kind of what I'm trying to do right now, is just parse out the signal from the noise. And one thing that we do know is, especially at the stage you're at right now, where you have a lot of training experience, so you learn very quickly. But when the goal of specifically building muscle mass is pretty new to you, it really just doesn't take that much stimulus to achieve that. So if anything, we want to get the most out of the least and then kind of build from there. So something we've been working on a lot is just getting the most out of every set. And that might not mean like training to failure forever. It's just that right now, in an effort to maximize efficiency and to understand like what each specific stimulus is doing as far as a response, we're just trying to to highlight each specific part and then make that as high quality as we possibly can. Like let's choose a limited number of foods, a limited number of exercises. Let's impose a limited amount of stress on your system, and just kind of see like what happens when we kind of wipe the slate clean. And unsurprisingly, like a lot of people just with that clean slate improve so many different aspects of their health. Like, are there some specific things that you could just mention to the audience where it's like, oh, I didn't really expect that like that would get a little bit better? Like what have you noticed just in an attempt, and I say an attempt because I'm constantly in this stage too, an attempt to do less. Like I really plan on Saturdays to just like come home and chill and do like nothing. I got home at like, I don't know, maybe 6:30 last night or something. So, what should have been like 5-6 hours of doing nothing was probably like a couple hours. So it's absolutely a work in progress for me as well. But like in the process of attempting to do less, like what sort of stuff have you noticed?
I think the biggest observable difference on my end is kind of like you just said. There's been this shift towards my mindset of like, let's recover hard. And it's almost like the flip opposite of what I've done for a long time, is just like being pretty mentally consumed with whether or not I'm doing everything I can to get better. And that, this was a big question that I knew we would dive into and that I wrote down for you guys, is just, how do I manage my tendency to overtrain? And with this shift in my mindset, and just literally just like relaxing more, of like, I'm finding more time for other things, and I'm like, pouring a little bit more time into education and things like that. And it's all helping just the quality of individual training sessions just get better. Outside of just like training things getting better, it's hard to say. It's relatively new. There aren't like any like things that I'm necessarily like measuring that I can like make big claims on. I think a big part of it is just just like this mindset where I'm like recovering as hard as possible. I'm like trying to sleep better, trying to like carve out time on a daily basis to relax and not be so focused on work or be focused on my training, or where like previously, like if I have like a gap in my schedule, like I'm fucking doing something, like I'm mobilizing this or mobilizing that. Now I'm just like, all right, well, let's like chill in the back room and like talk to somebody, or like, and just like taking my mind just away from training, and having a little bit more of a healthy balance.
Yeah. So, an interesting anecdote, or at least I think it's interesting, that I actually haven't. I don't think I've shared this with you, Ethan, but Ethan and I started training together a while ago now. But I, like you, Kyle, for the longest time had a really high degree of anxiety moving away from like a lot of training. Like I was used to training 6 days a week for like years, like starting at the beginning of college all the way through and after. And it was very difficult for me. I've mentioned this a couple times now, but like people that are, the audience listening to this kind of thing, and people like yourself and Ethan, like the tendency is to do more, and the tendency is to have a tough time taking rest days. So kind of, we have the opposite problem that most people have, which is like, how do I get motivated to train? It's like, we're like, how do we get motivated to take a day off, or to sort of pull back? And what really, I think that there are multiple ways that you can go about that, in terms of getting comfortable taking off days. The first is obviously just doing what you're doing now, and like just working on relaxing, which is kind of like, it's obviously ironic to some degree to have to like be intentional and to be calculated about relaxing time. My brother is someone who has that issue, and he actually puts the word relaxed or relaxing into his schedule during certain periods of the day, so that he knows that he has to relax. So, I mean, that it seems kind of silly, but actually it works for him. So maybe it could work for you too, to schedule relaxation time, because then it kind of like feels like it's productive. You're like, oh, I'm doing what I said that I was going to be doing. So, here I am being productive, which may work against some people. But for me, do you have it scheduled in? Yeah, no scheduling. Scheduling, no scheduling. Yeah. But anyway, my ticket into being okay with training less was two main things. The first thing was training with Ethan, because when I started training with Ethan and we were doing however many sets we were doing, a lot of sets, our workouts would be, we would train 5 days a week. We would take off Wednesdays and take off Sundays. And we would do, we would work out together on Mondays. We would travel all the way to New Jersey. At the time I lived in New York, so then I had to go back to New York. And then Tuesday through the rest of the week was at Hype. And it was just a lot of training. Like it was more training than I ever had done. And so eventually I did that consistently and for long enough where eventually I started to really enjoy Wednesdays and Sundays. I'm like, oh my God, like I get it. I've earned this rest day. And I think a lot of people don't end up there just because they maybe don't get fatigued enough. Like they're not training hard enough or long enough to be able to observe those actual, like, in my head, like I feel like my head is cloudy type of fatigue, like the type of fatigue that affects your digestion and your mood and your sleep. And so I had never just trained that hard for that long before, ever. And so I was never at a point where I was like, I need to, like, take my foot off the gas pedal. So for me, that was like a very much, and I never got hurt. I never, nothing ever went that far, but it was basically just like, it was the first time that I really observed like the cognitive effects of training like a bodybuilder actually trains. And so that was kind of my ticket into being okay with pulling back from it. And then once I was, sort of able to see or to have that new perspective, it was a lot easier to sort of come back into things in a little bit more of a reasonable, sustainable way. I think usually, I think most of the population is either where we are sort of at naturally, where it's like overtraining is the thing, pulling away from training is hard, or like not motivated to train at all, like very difficult to get into the gym. There are very few people, I feel like, on the whole, who fall right in the reasonable middle of the spectrum, which is like, okay, I'm going to train my ass off when I do train, but I'm going to rest and recover hard. Like that's a really difficult place to sort of end up at. But I feel like just the fact that you're having the conversation and you're having the questions and you're inquiring about it to begin with is like the sign that you're headed directionally in a good place. So I don't know if that breeds any more or thoughts from either of you, but we can.
I mean, the question.
No, yeah, absolutely. Go ahead, Ethan.
The question that comes to my mind, when someone says, overtraining is just like, how do we quantify that? Like, how do you know, that you were overtraining, previously, but you're training the right amount now?
So for me personally, or just in general?
Yeah, for you personally, not as like an intellectual, not as like, how should the audience know, but like, is there, what was telling you that you were training too much? Because I don't know that for me that's how I made the decision, where I'm like, I think Kyle's training, I think he should train less. It's much more of kind of like where I see things going directionally, and just having worked with people for a while to know, like, sometimes not so much that like, oh, this is scientifically the right answer, as just like, this is, maybe the best place to start right now. Because I think some people, might hear this conversation and think, oh, maybe I'm overtraining, maybe I need to do less. And they might want to have an idea of like, well, how do you assess that? Especially because it's very common to just hear like, someone else is doing this thing, maybe I should try that. Like maybe we should have a conversation just, between the three of us of like, how might we make that, assessment in the first place? Like, what was your experience with that?
So it's a tough question, because I think I can take snapshots of my journey, and I've been in very different places, where it's like on season for like an endurance goal, off season for an endurance goal. More recently, between basically like October of last year and February of this year, like cutting, where you're in like more of like a strength, like maintenance sort of effort. And so you're not, for while I was cutting, like there was no like progressive approach to training. Like I was always doing the same amount of training, pretty steadily. So there isn't a lot of like raw data to like measure whether or not overtraining is occurring, in terms of like, because when I was cutting, performance is just like not going to be great. But then there are more subjective things like, all right, this hurts, need to back off, not super motivated, but I'm training 6 days a week. Like I'm like obviously like motivated to train, but like, you start to think about your headspace before training, during training, after training, and even just like how your body just like responds to work. I think you always just need to have like a reference point. Like right now, for example, like doing less work and like being able to train harder. I know that my body is like challenged right now. Like workouts are more intense, getting a lot more sore than I have been in the past. Not that soreness, is progress necessarily, but and it's tough to say, because in the past, when I've had like real dedicated like endurance off seasons and I'm like really working on strength, sometimes there's like raw data and like I know that I'm hitting a performance plateau, right? And maybe that's not an overtraining problem, but just a problem of I progressed too quickly in a training cycle. Overtraining is just like this. I think it's a very non-specific sort of umbrella term as to like I'm not training appropriately, and or maybe my goal, maybe I'm trying to tackle too many goals at once. So I'm just doing too many different things, and I'm giving my body so much stimuli that I can't really navigate through the mess and determine whether or not I'm actually going in a positive direction. I think it's like a focus problem. It's a programming problem. There are a lot of things to consider. But I mean, more recently, earlier I mentioned just moving from 120 sets per week to 80. I would say that, yeah, I was overtraining because I wasn't, the quality of my sessions were just poor. Like if I look at like just like the actual quality of like individual sets, like I was hitting walls. I was like the effort that I could put into individual sets, and I was like deep in my cut and still tackling a pretty high volume and training frequency. I wasn't really enjoying training a ton, and I would get to like, whatever, I'm on rep number 10 and just like have nothing left in the tank, as opposed to like grinding through the set and like having, digging through some partial repetitions. And I don't know. I feel like I'm on a little bit of a I'm down the rabbit hole, and I'm a little not as focused of an answer at this point.
So there's always like a lot of confounders, right? Like you mentioned, you were dieting. It sounds like you were dieting, for 5-6 months. Like that, obviously has a huge impact on fatigue. When you're looking at performance, in this case, strength performance, we know that you can make performance gains in strength with a lot less volume than hypertrophy. So it may actually be more beneficial to do, significantly less sets, but it doesn't necessarily mean that your performance improvement is indicative, of an improvement in hypertrophy. And then we have all these other fatigue markers, maybe like soreness, motivation to train, but neither one of those things, with those two examples, really tell us much about the adaptation itself. And the adaptation is very difficult to measure. We really don't have any accurate way of acutely measuring the signal or, the ultimate like accrual, of tissue, within a subject. We may be able to look at a group of subjects over time and say, on average, this worked a little bit with that. But then, between people, you have wide variability, and it's very difficult, if not, I would say impossible, really, with the means that we currently have, to look at a training block and say, like, well, this worked better, for growing muscle than this did. So usually what we're measuring is, like I always say, the side effects. We're measuring the fatigue. And, hard shit is fatiguing. Like oftentimes the times we make the most progress, in life and any endeavor is when we're eating shit. So in many ways we typically look at fatigue as a sign of progress. Most people are like, I'm sore, therefore I'm progressing. But then when you looked at it the other way and you said, but when I'm mentally fatigued, I'm not progressing. And it's like, well, they're both just signs of fatigue, right? Like we don't necessarily want, more damage. We don't necessarily want more, mental fatigue. What we want is this, outcome of, skeletal muscle hypertrophy and, associated other regions that make the muscle. So because we can't measure that directly, we're in a very difficult spot. And, I often, struggle with this, with kind of conceptualizing this myself is like, we're really just kind of, we're just getting little glimpses, of where we are like in this journey, but we don't really have a great way to say, like, I did this and I got that response. So we're always just trying to like, kind of piece together where we're at and what did what, and at the end of the day, like, you never really have those answers. So I try to use more practical means of assessing like what the right decision is now, and specifically in regards to like training well. And the one thing I would say in general is a couple things. One, um, less training volume still works in regards to building muscle. Like, I don't think that like doing let's say like 120 versus 100 sets a week, or 100 versus 80, whatever, like, you're still gonna, even if you were growing muscle like at a slower pace, if you're growing muscle, you're winning. And there are a number of other buttons to push, right? Like, nutritional is going to be huge. Like having, enough calories, enough protein, is going to be huge. Obviously, if there's drugs in the equation, that's another big, button to push as well. And then, to a lesser degree, like we talked about before, just the things that you're doing that allow your body to rest and be, in a more relaxed state chronically. So if you are making progress and you say, all right, well, maybe I get there a little slower, but if you still get to the same endpoint, it's not that one works and one doesn't work. It's just one is riskier and one is less risky. So you're kind of deciding really like, what kind of person are you? And in two ways. One, it's like, I'm going to be the more risk averse person who's like, I know I can get to the goal. It might take a little bit longer, but if I do a little bit less and it's more sustainable, and I try to make that less, of higher quality, yeah, like maybe I'm not on, the razor's edge, and I'm not getting every last bit I can, which is most people like that go about this pursuit. Everyone starting out thinks they want to like optimize and like get the most out of everything. And I think the more mature you become, the more it's like, no, I just want to make progress. Like, optimization also tends to live on the edge of catastrophe, right? Like, the closer
Yeah.
you play that, the closer you play to high cost. And almost no one is in a position where they need to make that trade-off. Like, in the realm of building muscle, like, who's really in that position where it's like, well, I'm willing to trade, like 5% faster growth for like 50% more likelihood of problems. Like, almost no one's in that boat. So, and that doesn't, I'm not just saying blanket like, oh, you should do less sets. What I'm saying is, you kind of assess, um, one, like, the reality of the risk tolerance and the direction you're going, and two, just like how you like to train. And maybe someone else almost needs to step in and assess that. Like, if you're, like I mentioned earlier, just naturally really fucking strong and you can beat the hell out of your body, and you like to train really close to failure, you're probably going to need to do less. If you're someone who, being in the gym is therapy, and you want to be in there for a really long time, and you don't take sets as close to failure, and you aren't as strong, or you aren't enhanced, or whatever it is, like, that just makes it more tolerable, that's fine too. Like, I don't think either approach is necessarily so much better, and I don't think it's just this like linear, we're going to need to do a little bit more sets this year than we did last year kind of thing. um, I actually think they probably all kind of work, and like, it's much more about just being consistent and manipulating the other variables, like, for example, nutrition, pharmacology, what have you. As those goes up, like, most pro bodybuilders didn't really change their training like systematically. They all ate more food. Like, no pro bodybuilder ate the same amount of food when they started that they ate at 300 pounds in the off season. That never happened in the history of the sport. um, Very few guys took the same amount of drugs in their first cycle that they did, probably no one ever took the same amount in their first cycle that they did for their Mr. Olympia cycle. Um, but I've seen lots of guys train with less training volume. Like, for example, just reading through Dorian Yates's training journals many times, like, he was doing something. He had that career arc, like I mentioned before, where he kind of was doing like 60 to 80. It went up to about 100-ish sets or so a week, if I'm remembering correctly. and this is literally just me going through and counting. He had like a 9-day training cycle or something where it was like, you know, push and pull off legs, and I had this like revolving schedule. But when I went through and did the math, it was like, oh, he's training, you know, 6 out of 9 days, so that's, you know, 2/3, like multiplied by, you know, 7, carry 3, and it was like, all right, so he's doing, you know, 20 sets a day, but then I have to figure out what the average is for the week. And you basically found that like when he got to like Mr. Olympia status, when he was competing, you know, he was second place, he was moving to first place. He actually made like his best gains in that period in his career when he dropped his training volume way down. So there's not like a lot of the other things have this kind of like linear career arc where it's just like more food, more drugs, but training doesn't seem to work quite in that capacity when you're using sets as the marker of stimulus, which we often do in kind of like the evidence-based crowd. We're just like volume equals sets, but it's really not that simple. Like when you're taking into account like the actual like signaling processes and like what, you know, what constitutes an appropriate, you know, signal is more than just like the number of sets you're doing. And I think that's probably going to be the least clear trend that we see out of all those things. And I think if anything, that could pretty much stay the same throughout a career, you know, as you got stronger, as you got more efficient, versus the other things, which I think are all going to inevitably go up.
Okay.
Cool. So
So
some closing thoughts here just to kind of finish out. Takeaway maybe from this practically is you're not gonna fucking know, you know, what the right number of sets is. It's difficult and impossible to define. Overtraining to some degree. If I had to add my 2 cents to that little bit that Ethan just gave, it's like over time I've actually valued a lot more the subjective metrics of like my sensation of fatigue, but that's also something that's very difficult for a lot of people to hone in on and easily define, you know, like as something that is not an objective metric. So I do think that the tracking the objective metrics is useful and tracking things like performance is useful, but there are just so many different variables within the specific performance, you know, of the exercise that you're doing that may actually influence your performance improvement or lack thereof. You know, so for example, like if you're doing a set of rows on a particular machine and 1 week you have the seat one setting higher or you have the seat one setting forward or backward, and the resistance profile of the machine changes and how it interacts with you know its distance to your joints and how that changes throughout the set. Like all those things can influence performance in a hypertrophy context, which I feel like is you know, there are very few people who are taking the time to write down settings, you know, on machines. And, you know, even just standardizing that is difficult for a lot of people to really pay attention to, I think. So, you know, unless all those variables are in check, performance is also something that is kind of like dependent on the day and what actually those kinds of specifics you're setting up. So, you know, over time, like I said, I've spent more time paying attention to, you know, things like, am I taking regular shits, and am I digesting my meals the same way, or, you know, at least the way that I perceive it? Am I sleeping well consistently? Like all those things I tend to find as much, if not more valuable, especially if you're like really consistent and dialed in with the training, which it seems like, you know, obviously you are. So that would be my biggest takeaway from that too, is like it's very difficult to discern what does what unless you standardize. And I think if, you know, amongst all the other things that Ethan especially has taught me over the years in relationship to training, it's that the standardization, not just of the workouts and the sets and the approach to those sets, you know, that standardization is important, but so is the standardization of every other variable that has the potential to significantly contribute to your progress, right? Even things like waking up at the same time, you know, has that potential to really influence your perception of fatigue. So standardization is the name of the game, and as long as you are standardizing what you're doing and doing a sort of test retest in the most accurate way that you can, then you know, over time you just get a better idea of like what as Ethan was saying, is signal and what is leans more in the direction of noise.
Yeah.
So just to kind of wrap things up, any sort of final thoughts here in the last couple minutes? Anything else to briefly cover? Just on that note.
Practically, almost everyone, if we're like 2-3 standard deviations away from the mean, almost everyone's going to be between 10 and 200 sets a week. Far more people will be within 50 to 150 sets, a week. And then almost, like the majority of people listening to this are probably somewhere, in the like 75 to 125, 80 to 120 kind of range. Like most of that kind of like intermediate to advanced trainee natural guy is going to be 100-ish sets a week. So whether you're talking like Gen Pop, 10 sets, you can get away with it, not totally just suffer from like sarcopenia and osteopenia, like to like 10 sets a week, you're like a madman and you're Arnold, and it's not necessarily like you're growing so much more, but you're just training super high volume, like low effort, and then pretty much the majority of people just kind of end up settling somewhere in the ballpark of like 100-ish sets, and I think it all pretty much works. So just to give you some more like clarity, to just be like, you can fall anywhere within those ranges, but the average person is going to be ballpark 100-ish.
All right, well, I think that's a good finishing point. Kyle, thanks for coming on and having a chat. It was a good chat, and I'm sure at some point in the far future, or maybe we'll do an updated episode, see where you're at with things in a couple months, and have another chat. All right, man.
Sounds good.